Hello and welcome to the second episode of this grand adventure into trying to figure out how to set up my smart home and generally just mess around and try and get things up and running. Now, in the first episode, we saw I had some issues getting my hardware up and running. In fact, it wouldn't boot after putting everything together. At the end of that episode, I also mentioned that I had sent the motherboard back to the vendor, to Supermicro, to have a look at to see what was wrong and, if possible, get a replacement. So they sent back a reply saying that they tested it on their test bench and the board is fine. So that leaves two other main contestants or components in the server that could be the cause of the issue. Either it's the RAM or it's the CPU. So unfortunately, with these kind of issues, it's very difficult to figure that out without actually testing it. So it's already a good thing that I've realized now that the motherboard is fine. So that takes care of one of the three big contestants in what's causing the issue. So I had to get some connections going, and eventually I did manage to get someone to loan me a DDR4 RAM for 16 gigabytes, a different piece of RAM. So here we go again. I'm putting everything back together again, and because there was quite some interest after my first episode in figuring out a little more about my actual components, like what am I using and how do I install it, I decided to give a little more explanation about the entire setup and how I'm putting it together and what and why I picked specific hardware components. So the first thing that I looked into was what CPU do I want? And I immediately came on to, I went looking for server CPUs and then comparing them and figuring out, what is how much do I want to pay and what is on the market, and then checking a whole bunch of reviews and specs and test bench results. And eventually I came up with something that's pretty good and in my price range was the AMD EPYC 7232P, 3.1 gigahertz. It has 16 threads, 8 cores, a 32 megabyte memory cache. It's pretty fast. Now, this CPU had a SP3 socket, which is actually the size of the socket, or the form factor, as they call it, of the CPU that have to go on a motherboard. So that's important to know, because then I had to look for a motherboard that had that kind of socket. I eventually came upon a Supermicro, I believe it's the H11 SSL-I. And I had a look at that, and I did notice that the processor I chose was actually one of the latest revisions. So it was at the moment, or at the time when I picked it, it was literally just coming onto the market. So it was brand new. In fact, a lot of the motherboards, there were actually only 2 or 3 motherboards who actually supported that CPU. So I had to do quite some digging to actually find it. And the problem was, or the difficulty was, is that this motherboard had 2 revisions. Revision 1, which would not support my CPU, and revision 2, who did support the CPU. So I was, quite stressed when I got the actual motherboard to open it up and have a look and make sure it was revision 2. And I did see it was revision 2, because on the motherboard itself, so it is actually written on there that it says, it's the H11 SSL-I revision 2. So that's the motherboard I have. It's a very good one. It has a lot of features. It actually has a small CPU and a small dedicated mini CPU that is used just to be able to control and monitor the motherboard itself. So you are actually able to plug in an Ethernet cable and do something with IPMI. You can actually remote login. It's like just going to a website, and you remote log into the motherboard, and that works even if, like in my case, even if your RAM isn't working, your CPU isn't working, it doesn't matter. You can still actually contact the motherboard and do all sorts of things. So it's a very cool motherboard. Another thing was the hard drive. So I wanted to really look into a very cool and very good hard drive. I figured, I'm going to be using it quite a lot. So it needs to be something that's quite enduring, but I also want something to be super fast. So I was really looking in the market again, what can I find here? And eventually I came upon, well, it had to be an SSD. I wanted a solid state drive. So I went with a Samsung 970 Pro. Now I went with the Pro, but there's also an edition called Evo. Now the difference between Pro and Evo, to not go too technical, because you can look those things up yourself, but the main difference is that the Pro does seem to have a little more endurance, so it's able to handle databases a little better than the Evo version. So I went with the Pro version specifically for that aspect. Now it's a terabyte, which should be fine for me to get started with. If I need more data in the future, I can simply get some really big drives and just slot them in and then use those as my data. But for now, I think I'm going to just put everything on that 1 terabyte SSD and have it go as quick as I can until that 1 terabyte doesn't do it anymore. Now, using an M2 connection instead of a SATA means that one, installation is much more easy, because as you can see, you're just plugging it in directly into that, and that's it. That's the entire installation, so you don't need to mess around with wires. So that's one thing. The other thing is that the PCIe connection that it's actually using is so much faster. It's crazy faster. In fact, you can get 3,500 megabytes per second just for the copy action. So, and it should really be noticeable, especially on a system like Dataminer, where you want things to go as quick as possible. Now then, the last thing was actually the cooling. So I bought the CPU, the AMD EPYC, but I needed a cooler. So I had a look, and again, Googled, spent some time referencing different things, comparing the specs, comparing the reviews and all of that. Ended up with the Dynatron. It's pretty big, but it's not too big. So it fits pretty well in there. And then I combined that with a cooling paste, because you need to get the surface area between your CPU and between the cooler that you put on top of it. It has to be extremely well, there has to be an extreme good contact. And a thermal paste, a very good one, will actually decrease the temperature of your CPU with sometimes up to 10 degrees centigrade compared to having a bad cooling paste. If you're not using any cooling paste at all, you're probably going to overheat your CPU. So it's very important that you have that on there. And then when you apply it, also make sure that you try and apply it in a way that when you push on your cooler on it, that it'll nicely spread and try and cover as much area as possible. So I usually go with a quick, X and then a couple of dots, and then just get everything else that I have left over on there. And then putting on the cooler itself, just make sure that you nicely lower it, and then you nicely tighten the screws. Always go diagonally as well. Always tighten the screw at the left top and then the right bottom, and then the right top, left bottom. Anyway, always go diagonally for these things. Once all of that is done, the time came to test it out. So I hooked up a screen, hooked up a keyboard, hooked up a mouse, and I pressed start.
Oh! It's alive!
It's moving. It's alive. Oh, it's alive. It's alive. It's alive. It's alive.
Yeah, I was quite pleased, quite happy, of course, to finally get something happening. My motherboard manual actually says it needs to be a DDR4. It can be 3200 megahertz, and it needs to be ECC, error correcting something, control, I think. Now, I had a look at all the specs that I could find for my RAM and anything else I could find, and I could not find any note about ECC or non-ECC, anything at all. So then I also looked up, does the motherboard actually support non-ECC if it says it wants ECC? And it turns out that the answers on the forum boards were quite vague. It said some of the motherboards on Supermicro say that they support ECC, but they also work with none. And then some of the motherboards actually say the same thing, we support ECC, but then they only support ECC and it does not work with non-ECC, which was the case here. So I have non-ECC, but then how did I figure that out if all the specs don't mention ECC? Well, buried deep down in a forum board where someone had the same question, I believe 3 years ago, someone answered and said, well, the vendor Corsair only makes non-ECC RAM. So they don't put it on their specs because they only make non-ECC. So now I'm in the situation where, first I'll hand back the memory that I loaned from that person, and then I'll have to buy new memory. And for the love of God, I hope this time it'll be the correct memory. It'll have to be DDR4, it'll have to be ECC and registered. So I'll try and make sure I get everything correct this time. So I'm very excited. I hope you are too. And well, let's see what happens together, right?